accept the certain request.
Hello, I'm Hyun Kim. It's the second theme of today's conference. This conference is venue to share the research result that will conclude the research of the selective 5 team that presented WTA proposal and research. WTA means what is to be asked. So we start with the question of how to respond to the challenges during the pandemic. So we collect all the questions, images, and hashtags gathered on the platform, as well as 123 proposals submitted were actually the real record of the situation. And then PRAUD, developing their idea of the changing patterns of cities and transportation and then all the relationship. So I'd like to see how they've developed. So let me introduce PRAUD first. Rafael Luna is here. He's a co-founder of PRAUD and then and professor of Hanyang University. PRAUD conducted research on beyond the third place. Would autonomous mobile space provide the fourth place in the post-COVID-19 era? So, Rafael, could you share your presentation when you're ready?
Right, so today I'm going to present the final outcome of the proposal for what to ask, which we titled Beyond the Third Space, would autonomous mobile space provide the fourth place in the post-COVID era? So when we were thinking about what to ask, we were discussing what are some of the things that have fundamentally changed in the way that we interact spatially in the city. And we were thinking about this condition of the third space, which is a post-colonial term coined by Homi Bhabha, used to define a space of encounter or exchange, a space for dialogue or interconnectedness. It's an in-between space for cultural hybridity. So Homi Bhabha would see it as a space where we would exchange ideas and meet and socialize and have interaction with one another. Although it was not coined as a physical space, it's more of a philosophical space. This has transformed the ways that we had developed social spaces in the city. We can look at this from a capitalist point of view, the model of Starbucks, for example, using the term third space to show the space that you socialize between home and work. One of the spaces that is the most obvious to us in terms of the third space between home and work, as home being space A, work being space B, let's say. We can think of the space of mobility, the space that moves us in between, and we can start thinking what are the conditions in relation to this post-colonial term of socialization, interconnectedness, cultural hybridity. How has that transformed, right? This is our new reality, specifically in Seoul, where it has become about individualization as opposed to mass or the masses. Everybody is individualized through the use of masks, which secure the personal space, and at the same time, restrictions about talking on the train, everybody using their cell phone in terms of just producing some type of social interaction or entertainment while you're in that third space. So there's a lot of loss in terms of this interconnectedness in the third space. Instead, there's this new promotion. What will be the new mobility as a third space in terms of safety with regards to COVID, right? There's a promotion of the use of the automobile as a space where you can be safe. So we've gone from that mass transportation into an era of more prolonged individual transportation, which was something that we have been pushing in the 21st century to get away from and move more towards the interconnectedness of mass transportation, reducing the use of the automobile. But this has become a new reality where the automobile has become the space of safety, let's say, but also a new condition, a new third space, a new social space, where we're using the car no longer just for mobility, but also for socializing, producing some type of human connection, some new events, new spaces, even things that we would conceive before have come into the use of the automobile in the personal space, right? So if we think of how this is going to affect the continuation of cities in relation to COVID-19 and future technologies that we're investigating, we're moving to an era of smartness, the autonomous mobility, let's say, being one of them, where there's no longer the need to drive, or actually no longer the need of a driver. Instead, we can see all of these personal vehicles as movable rooms. So we see this condition as moving towards an autonomous mobile space instead of autonomous vehicles, where we can have the space for the family, the space for socializing, space for work, separated from everything that has to do with the social awareness with the COVID-19. So following in this continuation of what to ask, right? If this is a reality that we're moving on to, and again, this is a highly speculative, but let's say it's an educated guess, we can think of what would be some of these spaces that could transform into these autonomous mobile spaces. And already Seoul has this indication of compartmentalization through the use of the room, the urban room, commonly known as the bang, right? So we have the PCbang, multibang, norebang, jimjilbang, all these ideas of the room, which are meant to be a social space, but also a compartmentalized space, have the potential of being transformed into these social interactions through mobility. And already we also see in the city these other types of compartmentalized amenities and services, some of which are already mobile, but that achieve a micro-architectural space in the city, which could easily be adapted into these mobile rooms. So if we're thinking about services, spaces of amenities, spaces of interaction, social interaction, and all these sort of conditions moving towards the autonomous mobile space, then we really have to consider what are the implications of mobility in relation to architecture, especially when these are the future scenarios that we're looking at constantly with new design firms like IDEO or Bosch, for example, idealizing the idea of the mobile space as the future of workplace, for example, or the future of these X spaces. So we can look at the lineage that mobility has had with architecture and the way that mobility has transformed architecture and the architectural typology, starting from the single home, finding the need for where to store the car, making an additional room, bringing the car in the home, lifting the home from the ground to give space to the car, and these other mutations that have continuously occurred as we advance our technologies in construction and construction systems that have radically transformed the way that we conceptualize this interaction between the vehicle and architecture. Transforming into radical typologies, as we have seen in El Helicoide, for example, in Caracas, Venezuela, or the Lingote factory in Turin, to more contemporary situations, like in Hong Kong, the elevator that brings the car all the way to your living room in a skyscraper, and more traditional ways of interpreting automobile typologies, like the drive-through, drive-in, drive-to typologies, right? So this again puts us in the question of what to ask in terms of how is architecture going to transform when we have these movable spaces. Where will these movable spaces plug in or mutate the current existence of architecture or the current understanding of architecture? This, I think, puts us in a critical point in time that is analogous to the 1960s when firms like Archizoom and Archigram and Superstudio were also asking these questions, right? What is going to be the future of our cities? And at the time, of course, they were having more pressing conditions coming out of World War II and the threat of Cold War and the Berlin Wall and all these very political, social, dramatic conditions that led to dystopian or utopian visions. And I think we're at the same point in time that due to the uncertainty, let's say at political level, economical level, environmental level at the global scale, we face the same challenge of asking, well, what will be the way that we can think of cities using these new components that we have already envisioned, the movable room, right? So for example, re-envisioning an instant city, which was once proposed by Archigram in the 60s, we can imagine that by having autonomous mobile spaces, you can drastically reprogram urban voids around the city. We can immediately bring amenities and services through these movable rooms to places that need them. For example, monocultured apartment blocks They could be radically transformed if you bring an instant educational platform, an instant entertainment platform, or other type of services and amenities, really bringing the plurality of the space, right? Or the idea of a vending city, if everything has to be compartmentalized and separated and distant in order to maintain some safety regulations that have to do with COVID, is the autonomous mobile space one that's going to be doing all the servicing around the city, collecting in one space, bringing it to another space? Or as the social agenda of social distancing keeps on expanding or becoming more of a common rule, how is the city going to become a distant city where no longer you have the need to go to a restaurant or have food delivered to you, but instead you have the experience delivered to you, right? You can have these autonomous mobile spaces that pick up let's say the services and amenities, and they bring it to you so that you experience it in your own individual compartmentalized situation, away from all the risks of COVID, let's say. This, we hypothesize or theorize that, again, we could think of a Go city, a city that's ruled by the idea of mobility, of autonomous mobility, where you no longer have the need of modern grids, let's say, but instead you have swarm formations that create the urbanity. You have the idea of dezoning, no longer the need of having a singular zone, but if you're able to bring all these instantaneous amenities and services, then the city will truly be mixed and hybrid. And you have this idea of movable distance collective spaces as opposed to fixed social spaces. So in that scenario, we ask again, what will be the role of architecture, and especially of architects envisioning these new futures? We can think of new typologies that would have to deal with these new plug-in movable rooms. We can think about what will be the new prosthetics that get attached to traditional means of architecture. You could have a modern frame that has the static space and the service space, but now you could have these new prosthetic spaces of active, movable, transformable spaces, constantly changing the architecture. How will we facilitate socially distanced human interaction? Again, if we go back to the idea of the third space being one of interaction, but if that's a condition that is lost, what will be the new third space in that situation, right? So we have the rules of social distancing of 2 meters, that a person has to stay away from the next person in a 2-meter distance in order to not wear a mask and be safe from transmission of the virus. This can be diagrammed as a social space that demarcates the private space or the individual space as a 2-meter separation from each other, right? The collective becomes this 2-meter separation. And we start thinking that 2-meter separation is almost a wasted space. Could the 2-meter separation actually become surface? Could it become usable? Could it become interactive? Could it become architectural? Can the 2-meter space, for example, in this diagram showing the 2-meter space being a uniform table where one can have a dinner or work or read, right? So in thinking about beyond the third space, we conceptualize the idea of the half space, where on this diagram we see on the left the idea of a full space, the traditional working environment, being shrunken to the half space, where the 2-meter distance becomes the physical representation of the space. And if we think about these movable pods having the potential of bringing somebody into the space, then we can have this transition or this flexibility of exchange within that usable framework, where a pod can bring a person to one of these voids, pop them up, and use the space as they see fit. So the half space could be one of these conditions that we could start envisioning as an interaction between the autonomous movable space, autonomous movable room, and the way of physically manifesting these 2-meter separations. This would create the X space. I think theoretically this would challenge more theories of culture of congestion, the theory of verticalism, once proposed or understood by Rem Koolhaas as the idea of layering different programs in one single building in order to produce the effect of the city, the social congestion within one building in order to produce events. And more importantly, something that I think was maybe not misunderstood, but somehow misguided or not fully represented is his notion of understanding the interaction that occurred in the New York Athletic Club in the 9th floor, where you have the locker room, boxing and wrestling zone, and the oyster bar, which could be envisioned as in a theoretical point of view, you could have boxers changing in their locker room while eating oysters, which sounds like a ludicrous composition, but in a way, what it's envisioning is a really pixelated and hybrid way of understanding how you can interact between programs and merge the programs in one space. But the idea of verticalism and layering has produced the notion of mixed use as something that separates program. Traditionally understood as this stratification of program, where we have commercial, then office space, then residential, then some other space, right? When in reality, what we're trying to achieve in these highly congested cities is the idea of pixelation, mixing, social condensation, social congestion, interaction, interconnectedness, right? The idea of this third space becoming a physical space. And I believe this half space could be something that allows this pixelation, because if any autonomous movable vehicle can bring any service or amenity and be placed in any of these 2-meter gaps, that means that the half space could be transformed by individual users into whatever they need and produce these spaces that can still be serviced at the collective scale. They can still be serviced, but at the individual scale, you can have these spaces function, let's say, as a cafe where I go eat and meet somebody and just have an interaction with one person, while somebody else could be working or somebody else could be having a Zoom meeting, and really distribute this horizontal space as a mixed, pixelated, interconnected hybrid space. And how can we live together and yet stay distant, right? In the idea of this 2-meter separation due to COVID-19, we can also interpret or speculate on new typologies of housing, where the mobile space will become this X space in the house. So here you have a situation where you have co-living between 2 roommates. Each of them have their own mobile space. Each mobile space could function as their, let's say, personal workroom. But as it plugs into the framework of the residence, you have this condition that each roommate has their own private bedroom. They share a bathroom. And they have their own individual mobile room that they can use. And the mobile room can have this lift that allows them to come to a second floor where they can have this physical interaction. In this case, it's a 2-meter separated table, right? So you can have 2 roommates that you could say live together, but not really. They live together but separated. You would have all these mechanical systems for food delivery that would bring the food. You no longer would have the need of a kitchen, and you would share the meal, right? So everything is compartmentalized, separated, yet at the same time you can still have social interactions. It would become highly mechanized, a highly mechanized system that uses the autonomous mobile space as a plug-in, right? So what would this be like for a fourth space city? Will it become something that totally compartmentalized? We become socially distanced, GPS guided, de-zoned, pixel programming city. And that's the sort of what to ask conclusion of what, if all of these technologies are things that we're moving towards, then what will the city be in the future with all of these situations and these speculative scenarios? As a way of wrapping up this research, we were thinking of proposing a pavilion where you can experience this condition of the half space that we were talking about. Although we cannot build an autonomous mobile space due to, let's say, budget restrictions, we can interpret what would be the condition of these flexible and transformable half spaces, right? So we want to propose to build a pavilion type condition that produces this physical manifestation of the 2-meter gap as the usable surface, that you can go up and down and use the space underneath in order to propose a space where we can exhibit all this research. But in a way, this is not as a way of representing graphic research, but as a way of really experiencing the future situation that could happen if we really start manifesting what a half space could physically transform into. These 2-meter separations that could really have an impact on the way that we perform in the spaces that we occupy now. And with that, I will conclude my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Rafael, for your presentation. Can you mute your microphone?
Yep.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. So let's continue to the panel discussion. Before that, I'd like to introduce our panels. Professor Annie Pedret from Seoul National University College of Fine Art, and also Professor Alberto Gonzalez from the University of Utah Asia Urban Ecology Department. Thank you for joining us today. And then I think if you have any topic, Rafael, you'd like to discuss with them, you may suggest it, or the panel may also feel free to give your opinions on this research.
I'm, first of all, very intrigued by these various, I like these 4 types of cities: the vending city, the distancing city, the go city, the other ones that you have. The whole project is very, very interesting. The question that I want to ask is, there's still in this conceptualization, and I'm not saying this as a criticism, it's just an observation, that mobile is one thing. And whenever mobile space is represented, it's always looks like it's been designed by a car designer. And then there's mobile, then there's architecture. And then in some ways, the hybrid or your half space city or your typologies for the half space, the pixelated space, is in some ways another evolution of that history which you gave us from, in the history of architecture, from the radical 60s and the whole history of garages and et cetera. But what I'm intrigued by, how would architects design the mobile space in a way that doesn't make it a car, like a version of a car? What does mobile space, and I'm super love this one of the swarm, and I can imagine, like, how do architects build this city where that architecture swarms around, not these cars that can then plug in somehow into the pixelated architecture, because architecture, as we know, has to be architecture. But how do we break that boundary between what is mobile and what is fixed? And architecture is always more or less fixed, unless.
Yeah, so I think that was one question that we had at the beginning of this speculative research, that we know that there are companies like IDEO and Bosch that are specializing on just, let's say, the autonomous mobile workplace, and there are design firms. So they're not, car firms like Ford, BMW, or whatever. It's an actual design firm that's trying to figure out how to use this autonomous mobile vehicle as a autonomous mobile space. So one decision that we took from the beginning was, should architects be the ones designing this, because it's a highly, I would say, industrial product. I think our knowledge of the mechanics of it are a bit lacking, I would say. Not to say that we couldn't design it, but we just took the attitude that perhaps just as it works now that car manufacturers design the car, this is still going to be the role of another industry, the design industry. I don't know if it's industrial design or with the automobile industry, focus specifically on designing these pods, and they dominate the market, leaving us out of the condition of, can architects design this? So I understand the question, I think, but for us, we just took the attitude that we are not going to have the chance, or we shouldn't design the pod itself, because there's going to be professionals that dedicate their life to just designing this, and they'll dominate the market. So instead, we should think of what will be the architecture that gets affected by these designs of the pods. Because then we were thinking of, would it be about movable architecture and movable buildings and things like that that don't really scale up? Like the movable pod moving around the city to a whole movable building. We could go into sci-fi. I mean, even in movies like Star Wars, they have those giant moving buildings in the middle of the sand dunes, which I don't want to go into Star Wars, but anyway, we didn't want to get into the whole idea of movable architecture as the object itself, instead of just the movable pod, and leaving that as part of another industry that takes care of it, and it's already taking care of it. So I don't know if that was a kind of laissez-faire attitude, but let's
just keep doing things the way we always do things, which you guys take care of that, and we will do the architecture, and you will do the landscape. So really, if you look at futures, we can't be in our own disciplines anymore. This idea that this is what we do and this is what you do, and we'll just do it our way and you do it your way, I think really stifles a huge potentiality. But what if you were to work together? What if the architects and the mobile people got together and said, we're going to make this an autonomous, autonomous space. It does not architecture. It's an autonomous. Right. I mean, what's so interesting about the swarm thing, all of a sudden it stops being about vehicles swarming. I imagine this as, oh my God, you could create this city that always changes according to requirements, that they could, but it creates a city in an architectural way. I don't think it eliminates architecture, but I think, the future isn't only about coming up with like great forms. It's about how are we going to not only, the question I want to ask is, how are we going to work together? How are we going to think together? And so I would, if I were to encourage this research to go further, I'd say break down those boundaries, because all of us have really interesting things to cross-pollinate with somebody else. And I think that's where some really interesting things might break through this whole trajectory, which I really loved your little history of how the car has interacted with architecture, which I'm just going to add one more example. Cedric Price did a very similar idea of a mobile school in Detroit. And so you want to look at that, because it's actually it's on that edge of architecture, using, you know, existing things that can be movable. And so I encourage you to look at that.
Yeah, and I think you touch on a point that we actually had a discussion, Dongwoo and I, in terms of one of the other critical points, if you start thinking of the swarm formations, is what are the physical states of a city that need to be static in order to produce infrastructure for services and amenities, you know, water, sewage, those sort of things, right? Are those going to be able to move around? But maybe that's why we need collaboration, right, with other industries. But it led us to thinking that, okay, we don't have time to figure out that part yet, but the key point is to think of what this produces, which you mentioned, is the city as all architecture. Everything becomes architecture. There's no, yeah.
There could be architecture. You could take Jona Friedman's Ville Spatiale
Right,
and have framework. You know, it could be if you, okay, let's just pretend like these spaces can move around. That's what he imagined, that there was a socially mobile society, and then in fact you could move these things around within a framework. That starts to be really architectural. But then what is, and I think you're absolutely right, what is static, you know, and what can move around, and all of a sudden services, drain, you know, sewage. Again, it gets down to the core of what a city is. All cities are structured by sewage and water. How do we design those in a city where all of a sudden we can swarm around? And
right.
you know, that will in fact be probably the design of the sewage and the water will be the defining factor that gives form to the future city as you know, that version.
Yeah.
Of the
Because I think so the other infrastructures all the other infrastructures could be movable, even electricity. Well, MIT has been trying to develop wireless electricity for over a decade now, I think. So I think all the other services, telecommunications, energy, all of those could be movable. It's as you mentioned, it's water and sewer that still hasn't been solved as something.
There's new technologies to deal with water. Like water, I don't know. We have to figure water's water, but sewage, who knows? There could be new technologies and that starts to bring in. So I want you to talk to car designers, engineers, you know, and architects. And I'd like to see that group of people together at the table to design this thing. Because I think that the initial, you know, proposal and the research is totally fascinating and totally really beautiful.
Thank you.
May I ask one question? First of all, well, thank you, Rafael, for a wonderful presentation. I think you definitely answer the question, what is to be asked, with a lot of questions. So actually, I was just, you know, taking notes of the many questions, but I would like to go back to your very first question in your cover, actually saying, would autonomous mobile space provide the fourth place in the post-COVID-19 era, right? So you emphasize the importance of autonomous mobile space, like autonomous vehicles, but to my understanding, I mean, what is the actual definition of autonomous vehicle? It's just, you just don't need to drive that, right? They are gonna drive by themselves. So therefore you can focus your attention in doing other things, right? And this is kind of interesting because I remember when Uber first started, I was living in China, and China very quickly came up with their own Uber version, Didi. And I was kind of fascinated because you know, as a non-Mandarin speaker, I was living, and obviously when you live in a place and you don't understand the language, sometimes you get some surprises along the way. So I remember taking one of my first Didi's rides, and all of a sudden, the guy in the middle of the journey is saying something to me that I could interpret as like, you know, there's a change of plans. And actually, the person who arranged the Didi for me arranged one shared Didi. That means like I was going from A to B, but there was another person who I didn't know who was also going somewhere on the way from A to B. So that means that, you know, you share the ride with another person who you don't know. So it was, you know, it was fun, but it was quite a surprise for me. And at the time I was thinking like, wow, how cool would it be if we could actually design, but not design in the sense of architectural design, but more like a social design, how fun could it be if you could design who do you want to share your ride with? You know what I mean? Like all for a sudden, if you have your certain profile, as an architect, as someone who is interested in design, what not, right? Then this, platform, this application could match you, not in the not in the other way, but
So you're thinking of a car sharing social dating app.
Yeah, like not dating. Actually, you could match and have an interesting ride, especially in large cities like Seoul or Beijing or Shanghai, or any other large city in which you commute for over 30 minutes is already, good enough to have a conversation with someone. You could do networking, in that space. And but yeah, this was before COVID, so maybe this is not so much relevant nowadays, because now we could still have that. But what if we make compartments in the mass transit, in the mass public transport? Because you very quickly decided, all right, and I think that's true. Very quickly after the pandemic started, the use of private cars increased like crazy. I was reading some news precisely about China, in which the numbers of sales of cars increased rapidly right after the pandemic was starting. So, but what happens if we start making compartments in the public transport, right? Because we all kind of know that autonomous vehicles are not going to really fix the problem of transportation. I mean, those are kind of cool because we can focus our attention in other things, but they are still adding problems, adding artifacts that are occupying spaces in our cities. Therefore, we cannot minimize the spaces of roads. We cannot give more space for pedestrians. We can still feel the burden of having these devices around. So I wonder, what if we actually start talking about compartmenting the public transport systems?
I mean, I think that's an interesting point that I hadn't reflected on, the idea of socially engineering through the compartmentalization, that since everybody's already mobile through their mobile phones, and data is collected and your profile is all basically digital, then you can, or somebody can, engineer social interactions of this condition of, if the third space is to be understood as the space of cultural hybridity and interconnectedness, you could produce that through the digitalization of the human being, right? And then create these profiles of people. And yeah, as you mentioned, it'll be interesting if I'm going from point A to B and I have an hour to share the car ride with somebody that I can network with, or I can have a conversation about TV shows with, or something like that. And then that really produces the autonomous vehicle or the autonomous space as that third space that was originally conceived as a social space of interaction and mixture. Because, and again, this is somehow in a utopic type of vision, I would say that you social engineer this interaction, but I think it's quite exciting and quite interesting. And
designing the actual pods that you were beautifully showing us. But again, as Professor Pedret mentioned it, like, think we have to go beyond the standard borders of the architectural profession. So maybe we have to learn how to do this type of social engineering design.
This raises a question that your conversation, Alberto, about what is the nature of interaction in the fourth space, this hyperpixelated, hyper-separated, physically embodied, separated space. And so I love that image of, like, it looked to me like a cafe where everybody's like, really super separated. It looks like more like 4 meters than 2 meters. And so I'm thinking, so maybe that's the dystopic element of it, even though you have all this technology and all this adaptation to separation. What kind of interactivity or interconnectedness or a cultural hybridity can you achieve in that kind of experience of separation? And I think it works in terms of manifesting the functional requirement of we're going to keep everyone separated. That works great. But what about that other social, spiritual, factor that we're all missing? I don't know if we all are, but I certainly am missing. And somehow adapting weirdly to this weird mechanism of Zoom. And I'm now finding like maybe it's pure desperation, like this is really good because it's something and it's better than nothing. So I really, what is the nature of the interaction? If you're going to use Homi Bhabha and the third space, I'd love to hear more about, and I'm okay with it being dystopic. I'm kind of thinking, well, look, it's going to be weird. We're just going to have to get used to it. But I think I'd like to see that, thought about or articulated at least, and say, at least acknowledge it. It's going to be really weird.
Right.
This is just
I mean, it may be dystopic just for us, but the future generation will see it as the normal, right? So it's dystopic for us, and it could be envisioned as utopic for the next generation, because we are envisioning a space that is completely clean and sterilized from COVID, and everybody's separated and controlled. And the future generation will see it as that's the condition, the norm, and it's a utopian vision. But for us, it's completely dystopic because that's not where we come from.
But you can also make an argument to support your argument that we're already there, as you gave with that slide of the subway and how we're all in our own little worlds anyways. We just try to don't talk, look at my screen, don't make eye contact. We're already going in that direction. We're in a society where young people don't get up for old people. Like we're already, it's my world, my problem. So you could actually make that argument, but I would love to see that articulated a little, at least brought up to the surface and said, this is the kind of interaction that might engender.
What do you guys think? Also, not being from Seoul as myself, the context of Seoul in this scenario, because for me, when we started this research, I was thinking that already, let's say, thinking beyond COVID, that there's the idea of the bang, which is it's an urban room, it's an extension of the home, but in a way, it's also a separation because it's one room. It's not meant for like 100 people, right? It's either you go with a small group or yourself or whatever. So it's already a social compartmentalization of the density of like a really highly dense society. So that's where also we started, okay, if we look at it, the context of Seoul as opposed to in, let's say, Boston, it's completely different. Would it only work in highly dense societies, or could it be possible as a prototype around the world? Or again, is it just a dystopic future that eventually the rest of the world is going to catch up? But how do you guys feel in terms of it being contextualized to Seoul?
I think my initial, without thinking it through too much, is it's good for high density areas. But if we're going to follow the trend of, intense urbanization, which maybe COVID will now reverse, but the idea, because I think of the American life, and it is very separated. People live in neighborhoods where they never see a neighbor and they never see a person walking in the neighborhood. So it's already kind of podified, in pods. And so you could say it is a model, an urban model, big city urban model. And that doesn't decrease its legitimacy. In fact, it helps us understand how cities might look in the future.
Yeah, I've been talking to other professionals in Belgium that they have a research called Old City, Old Land, where they see sprawl as an actual effective, well, not effective, but an actual condition of urbanization, that it's not to be, while a lot of academia and research is done towards reversing that and producing a formal city and all these things, and sprawl is bad, they're looking at sprawl is just a natural condition that happens in Belgium, might not be good or bad, but it's just, it happens. And in that sense, it's already the mode for this COVID situation. It's already the mode of keeping everybody separated. If everything is spread out throughout the land, then everybody has their own situation. So that's why I was thinking, well, if you contextualize it just to Seoul, where it's highly dense and we do need to find some space, then is it meant only for highly dense situations, or are we going to have half spaces also occur in the Western world or in sprawling cities, or is there even a need?
Both is true, maybe to differing degrees. I mean, I love the idea of a mobile jjimjilbang, because if there's something I miss now, it's the jjimjilbang. And if I could get into a jjimjilbang, like some mobile thing with me and, you know, a couple of people, or just me,
Right.
I would be very
Hey guys, may I interrupt for a while?
Yep.
Sorry, I joined too late. What happened was today I originally planned not to attend this Zoom meeting because of other complicated scheduling issues. But suddenly I realized I have some time available, and
Thank you for joining.
And thank you. And I have a very strong interest in what PRAUD has been doing, and I'm from Seoul, so
Yeah, you can.
And I miss your presentation, obviously, but just assuming that it's not that much different from your previous presentation. And at the time, I asked you, I gave you a question about what would be the difference between architects working on this kind of project versus car designers and engineers, mechanical engineers working on the same concept. Because the reason why I asked the question is architect obviously has have to be concerned with all the other issues, not just the thing itself, this mobile unit itself, but the other urban issues, environmental issues, human factors, and cultural issues, all that. That's why we call ourselves architects. So my question is, I'm looking at your presentation before. My biggest question was, is it going to work in a city like Seoul? Because my point is that many part of Seoul is simply not quite accessible by automobiles. We have quite tough terrain, and also some streets are not the wide enough for any kind of mobility vehicle, mobile vehicles. So your proposed idea may work in sort of flat area where streets are wide enough, but for the rest of the area, hill communities and things like that, I have very hard time understand how it could be an effective means of transportation plus communication, as you proposed. What is your response to that?
Well, I wasn't thinking of it as an actual solved already problem in the practical means, but if I thinking about this situation, if we, which is something that we discussed earlier with Annie, of not leaving it up to the car designers and industrial designers, but interacting with them to design something as architects. But if we leave it to car designers, it's already being designed as part of the existing infrastructure, right? They're not designing new mobility that it's 10 meters wide and whatever. They're already using the guidelines that are already ingrained in the existing infrastructure. So even, let's say, hills in the Iwa Mural Village or Nitaiwan or any of these really hilly communities, right? The infrastructure, let's say, doesn't change. The roads are still the same. You still have all the existing cars going through, the existing types of cars going through these roads already. So there wouldn't be any difference from a new type of pod if it's designed by one of these car industries or designers, because they're already using the exact same dimensions. Which again, that was one thing of at the beginning of the research and why we left it to the industrial designers to design this, to not, because of the shortness of the research, but because we assumed that these were going to be a given. They would use the same dimensions, they would use the same guidelines, same infrastructure, and then the chance would be, well, how would architecture interact as the new transformation where these pods can connect to the architectural framework. But again, it's highly utopic and speculative, so I never saw it as a way of solving any real issues, let's say, for these hillside towns. Yep.
Sorry, if I may just jump in. I don't think it's that utopian, actually. When you look at your drawings, it's nothing more than a car that you don't need to drive. It's just, you just eliminate the burden of the driving attention. And then all of a sudden you have a space in which you can do things and you don't care about the rest. Okay, it can be more fancily design, like a little classy, sort of Mazda, Norman Foster looking item, or it could be, a more architectural element, as you were, showing us. But I don't think it's that utopian. I mean, the moment that you don't need to actually drive, it's just a space, and we know how human beings are able to survive in minimal spaces, especially recently. I mean, I'm pretty sure in a space of a van, you can have meetings, you can have, coffees, you can have parties. I mean, it's just square meters in which you can do things, and at the same time, those square meters are moving around. So as long as you're not kind of asking for, as you said, new highways or new elevated monorails, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, that part I saw it as it would probably stay the same, and it would just because you're using the same parameters. The utopic part would be, let's say, the envisioning of a Go city where truly everything can be movable, and we start really thinking about possibilities of swarm formations as opposed to grid formations, because we no longer need grids and everything can be GPS guided, so there's no need of even an address, right? You just give your PIN and somehow the mobile space goes there. So I mean, that in that part it becomes highly utopic, but in that sense we're not even talking about solving what happens in Iwa, Mural Village, or Itaewon, or any of these things. In those senses, it's like, huh?
Korea is already experimenting with 3D addresses. That's been already for a while. So that's giving a Z coordinate. So again,
as we move into these GPS locations and mobility, can you have a mobile Go city where everything is movable and changeable and transformable? That's when it becomes the utopic vision, or dystopic. Actually, I don't know.
This is what I think is quite interesting about your proposal. I think it's really about how we interpret the concept of a space. Because these days, unlike in the previous historical times, we create space not just in terms of physical, in terms of physicality of it. We can create space in virtual reality or cyberspace. But my comment about your proposal, at least based on what I saw in the previous presentation, is that it's probably a little bit too much of a literal interpretation of a space. Because your proposal is based on the concept of combination of movable space plus information hub, if I understand it correctly. But if we interpret the concept of space in a little bit more flexible way, probably the whole thing can have a different kind of shape. It doesn't even have to be in the shape of a mobile pod. Could be something different, even a small wristwatch, whatever. So that's my comment. Another comment of mine, as one of the organizers of this global call, is that I also had a very interesting conversation yesterday with another team. They've been working on the ideas of new type of parks in the post-corona time. And at the end of the conversation, my comment was that it's very interesting to have all these sociology related topics and all that, but probably because I'm an architect, I also like to see something a little more concrete, something that has forms and shapes and structure and some sense of tectonics and things like that. And your proposal actually is one of the very few among the all the proposals for this WTA, the open call, in that it has some sense of physicality to it. So I'm contradicting to what I just said before.
But that's the nature of being an architect, no?
That's right. That's right. So basically my point is that I really admire and the physical aspect of your proposal, but on the other hand, on a conceptual level, it can be reinterpreted as something a little different. So the actual room doesn't really have to travel. You can instantly create your own room with other type of means. So that's my comment.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we get so the philosophy of it in terms of defining the third space from the Homi Bhabha point of view, that it wasn't a physical space but a philosophical space, then yeah, you can really start. This is our new third space, the Zoom meeting, right? We're having interconnectedness and cultural hybridity. We have multi-cultures and multinational.
It must feel like a real space, because having done it so many times during this corona pandemic period, it starts to have its own element of physicality.
Right. But because of the nature of architects, we wanted to have something physical.
And I think that probably can link to the idea that we end up only choosing our backgrounds for the Zoom calls these days. I mean, that's like as far as we can go with the design of this space is choosing what sort of background are we gonna be showed.
I changed my mind.
Just like that. So yeah. Another thing I would like to tackle, I don't know if we have much time for
go ahead.
Yeah, I like the slides in which you were relating your proposal to Seoul or to Korea, I should say, right? With all these, like you say, PC Bank, Noraebang, and all these. I've been living in Korea for years now. I'm still fascinated with the Sangha, with this mixed use building that is comprising all sort of functions, usually on a kind of 5 to 6 stories. I'm saying this just in case there is someone who is not in Korea, joining through Zoom. It's amazing. I mean, you have a lot of different functions, from the academy to the kindergarten to the massage salon to the bowling to the dentist to the plastic surgery, all in one single activity condensator element, but with the particularity of being public. I mean, you can get in and out anytime. No one is going to ask you. No one is going to charge you. You can use the toilet, which is usually, very convenient anytime. I mean, it's a particular quality of Seoul to have these public spaces in which you can get in and out, and using those, as you said, in a more kind of compressed scale, maybe as compared to parks or to riversides by the Han River or whatnot. So I quite like that, and also I quite like your experimentations on the prosthetics, because I know you have been doing a lot of work on that, and I really think it's fascinating. Also, that prosthetics that are attached to the architecture, and that probably are just the receivers of those mobile pods. But those itself, I think, have a lot of potential and a lot of interest, I think. So again, thank you for bringing up so many, food for thought today.
Yeah, I think that the issue of the prosthetics is, well, as you know, yeah, we've been
Looking into this issue of what are the new emerging elements of architecture and that are not only functional or ornamental, but these new hybrid conditions. And if you end up needing these prosthetics to capture the pod, as you mentioned, then do those become also the new systems for producing the static spaces and the service spaces, and it becomes one integral machine or one integral architecture? Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it was a question? No, right?
Just following up on your comment.
So one more question about the exhibition, because we have to do an exhibition following up on this. Do you have any specific idea what kind of exhibition do you plan to have?
Yeah, I was showing that we want to develop a pavilion that
Shows the physical manifestation of the half space, something that shows this physical 2-meter separation and the possibility of mixed use even through separation and interaction through separation. So it's a physical, I mean, we call it as a pavilion. It's a micro architecture, but as a way of interpreting this half space condition as a actual object, something tangible, something that you can experience and feel the sensations of being in it and occupying it, and feel the dystopic relationship of being 2 meters apart from your person you're having a coffee with or something like that. So it's a yep.
Because again, as one of the organizers of this call, I think research is one thing, but an exhibition is another. So I was a bit concerned whether we are going to see a large number of enlarged pages
drawings
of a research
Yeah,
paper.
no.
Because we have
No,
to understand and accept the fact that exhibition is something on its own. It has its own language, it has its own grammar. It has a very physical and sensual aspect to it. And I'm not too much concerned about the PRAUD team. I said the same thing to other teams yesterday, but I'm just very curious what kind of end result
we were also thinking of the same thing, that for us it's more about
physical manifestation and the feeling and interaction with this half space, rather than just showing it as a graphic outcome, which you can
I'll be looking forward to it.
Yep. Any other questions?
I just am curious about architecture, and at once completely amazed by its disciplinary concerns and physicality and this impossible task of bringing buildings and cities into formation. And on the other hand, I get completely frustrated by the limitations of that. And I think if I have a wish, it's that that we don't give that up. That's an amazing quality of our discipline, but also to be more open, to bring in, to consider the social. In that pavilion, the top floor, everybody's separated, but on the bottom floor, there's no separation. So, I mean, so that's just that's an aside. But I'm thinking, I think we have the capacity, because we have to deal with so many people anyways, all the engineers, everybody else, that we could have a part of our research as talking to sociologists and philosophers and educators and lawyers and engineers, different kinds of engineers, and so I think that's my wish, because I think the opportunity here with COVID, and I'm not calling it post-COVID, I'm calling it its continuation of COVID.
Yeah.
Is that we have an opportunity to grow and to actually start listening to other things, because these problems can't be solved by us alone. And that's in fact what got us into this mess in the first place, is a whole world view that everybody's working in their own little well, and sometimes we come out with a very superficial idea of convergence and add it all together, but is never thinking together or working through a problem together and all the difficulties that has. But I think we're actually pretty suited to that. We already bring together a lot of problems and find a resolution to them. I think we could grow bigger and actually have some agency in the world if we actually did expand more. We wouldn't be the facade dressers of things that are already decided. And so that's my wish for the discipline. And I think you're actually poised to do that, even though the forces, every force of society is against that. But I think if we can't do it in these little exercises, which are fantastic opportunities for thinking, that we need to try to do that. But it's not going to be easy, because everything is designed to keep us separate academically, in every possible way, financially, academically, socially. This whole society is already designed to keep us together, not mean keep us apart. So how do we break through that? That's what I'm interested in. I'd like to design architecture, the discipline. I'd like to redesign the discipline of architecture and figure out ways that we could actually not only live together, think together, so that we can maybe figure out a way to live together while being separate, like bring those contradictions together.
Right. Yeah, actually, and going back to the pavilion proposal, one thing that we wanted to do as a physical state of that contradiction, which I didn't put in these axon drawings, but I wanted to put a plexi wall. I mean, there's 3 circles. So in the bottom, it forms a space that you can navigate in a triangle. And I wanted to put plexi walls, so when the space compresses underneath, that you are actually next to somebody else, but you can't touch them because of a plexi wall, while when you go upstairs, or the upper side, then you are free, but then you're separated by the architecture by 2 meters. And I think these contradictions is becoming more and more evident, where you can go eat with somebody, but then they put this plexi thing on the table, and you're like physically within 1 meter, but you can't interact with them. And then going back to the wish for the profession, I feel like more and more there's this desire of interaction and shared knowledge, but more and more there's also the highly specialization of the field, where everybody just wants to do their thing and takes one role. And I wonder how that's gonna, because even for this, going to your first question, why didn't we design the pod as opposed to leave it to the car manufacturers, and then me saying that we just give it up, right? Take it as a given that that's a highly specialized field and somebody else does it better than me, right? So I don't know if it'll end up being something like this, that we will understand our highly specialized skills and we leave it up to the other person that has the other skills, and it's more about how do we understand who has what skills in order to work together.
I think because we there's no reason. We need the hyper specialization. It's what gives us depth, but there is no reason other than this framework that we're in that I'll just let somebody else deal with that. Because it is hard to work together. It is not easy. It's easy to just say, I'm just going to do my piece and I've got complete control over it and I can do what I want and I don't have to argue with anybody. And so the latter is really much more difficult, but it's also richer. And the solutions tend to be, I find, more interesting, more holistic. They consider more. Yeah. And because of that, they're usually better. So they can be, I will say, they have a better chance of being better solutions. And so I think, I understand the forces that are keeping us apart, but I think, but it's my wish. And I think this is the time, because we are dealing with the kinds of problems where we cannot solve them alone. We just can't. They're not solvable. We're already dealing with complex and emergent problems in a hyper-networked world, and we're not getting out of this alone. We're getting out of this together, and that's clear. We saw the last 4 years in the US, and we're seeing maybe a change in the next 4, but nothing happens on its own anymore. And so I think there's some moment we have to wake up to reality and not our wish or what's expedient. Expedience is great, but it's an industrial model of the 19th century. It's what you do when you want to produce. And I think that works. We've done that. We've not only done it, it's created the problems we're in. We've overproduced, and now we've got a problem, and which we can't think our way out of by the production model. And so, and I think that applies to everything. It's the way you're paid as an architect. You have X number of hours and you have to produce, and so you do it. But there are these opportunities like this, a conference or a call for proposals or an exhibition or a publication, where you can actually maybe try, you know, if there's another call for proposals, I think you do it so that a mandatory 5 different disciplines have to work together, you know, minimum, you know, and then come up with a call for, you know, what, then ask them questions. What questions would you ask if you had to work with 5 other people? 5 other disciplines. So anyways, that's just, I understand totally, Raphael. I think you did an amazing job. But I also like to pick apart where the implicit assumptions within which we work, I like to pick those apart. Because those are the things that keep us back, that limit us.
Right.
Yes, I accept and understand everything that Annie, your name is Annie, right? Said. And but also on the other hand, I think after this open call is over, after the exhibition is over, at the end of the road, probably there is another big question waiting for us, architects, how we are different from other professionals. Because we have been trying very hard to understand the languages and messages coming from other disciplines, such as sociology, environmental studies and all that. But as I said, what makes us different from other professionals? Basically, that's what we also need to understand. And I think the whole thing about this WTA open call is probably a big, long journey to becoming able to answer the big question again. So that's why I think the whole process has been quite enlightening for me and hopefully for others as well. So I wish you good luck for your exhibition.
Okay, thank you.
Before we close, we had several questions on the YouTube. So if you are okay with that, I can ask one.
So maybe the name is Supercat. Supercat says, ask, everything could be architecture. This aspect is very impressive. When the concept of mobility or autonomous mobile space is actively reflected in architecture, I wonder what change will be made from the capitalistic perspective. That is.
Okay. So basically, how will the capitalist? Okay. Basically, how would the capitalist model change when everything becomes autonomous? Is that the question in general? Well, I don't think it would change much. I think it would be hyper-capitalist at that point. You can, well, it depends on where you are and how you view it, because you can easily make business models and business decisions and really exploit hyper-capitalism with the idea that now we can bring more services and goods to more people. Even if they can't access them, then we can bring it to them. And you can look at this from a socialist point of view, the city can do it, or you can do it from a capitalist point of view, right? Uber will do it, right? Uber will now offer Uber Jinjilbang brought to everybody, right? You can Uberize services. You can privatize all of these amenities and services through autonomy. So I don't think the capitalist model would change through the automation. If anything, if we're looking at future technologies, I think capitalism would change with the decentralization blockchain technologies that allow for decentralization of networks and these sort of things that are already changing governments, banking. That is one thing that would change, but autonomy of vehicles, I don't think that would change much of the capitalist system.
Yep. What's another question?
It's fun because you have a Hong Kong bank image at your background, right, Rafael? Is that the Hong Kong Bank by Norman Foster in the background?
Right.
I was just wondering if that's going to link to the very concept of land ownership, right? Because if everything is mobile, where's the land?
So,
then it's air ownership. Then you will have to pay for the air that you are occupying, because I believe that your mobility devices at the moment are attached to the ground, but at some point, if they can fly, they will fly. So who's going to pay for that air?
actually, yeah, I think that would be one way that you can. So again, it would
capitalist, but you can hyper exploit it. And one way that you can exploit that, if everything is movable, again, I would say that through blockchain technologies, you can digitize the city and the real estate. Basically, you could digitize the ground wherever you land or wherever you station, then that's the space that the city can tax you. And blockchain allows for micropayments and all these sort of conditions and quick and easy registration of ownership. So mobility of real estate or mobility of property, mobility of space, I think what it allows is the possibility of setting up new configurations, networks, and easily, well, not easily, I don't know the technology, I'm not a coder, but I'm assuming easily could be tracked, again, through blockchain technologies that acknowledge the registration, ownership, acquisition of property, real estate at any level. And if you digitalize ground, you can digitalize air rights, right? You can digitalize the city as a three-dimensional volume. Again, going back to Annie bringing La Ville Espacial of Yona Friedman. How do you tax that? Well, you digitalize by cubic meter the city, right? And very easy, again, I keep on saying very easily. In my mind, it's very easy to do. But you can very easily, to understand it, I would say you would have an app, right? And I'm occupying this space, or the phone can track where you are, and the city knows where you are, and then it can charge you micropayments on your location, on your positioning.
Scary.
I think, yeah, that's how I would imagine it. Charge everything. Okay.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Are you okay with one more question? Or yeah, okay. Okay, the question from Haji Shin is, have you tried to expand your idea to the larger volume of public transportation mode with typologies of transit hub, nodes, or etc.?
Not as a mobile, not as the hubs themselves moving, but already I'm exploring the idea of, and I keep on
back to these 1960s visions of utopias and proposals that I already imagined that we are living in, especially in Seoul, in a condition that was envisioned by the structuralist or the metabolist and even Team 10. Actually, Annie could prove me wrong in this one, but of Peter and Alison Smithson's Golden Lane condition of megastructures or megaforms, where the transportation network at large, let's say the subway systems in Seoul, they already connect the entire, well, not the entire, but almost the entire city as one continuous building, and it doesn't need to move. And basically, maybe that could be the static portion of the city where above ground everything can move, and underground the subway system works like a megaform, a mega structure that services everything above ground. And again, I imagine that this works as a giant built form, not as I'm not thinking of the train per se. I'm thinking of the tunnels and the infrastructure that goes into it, which, especially in Seoul, we occupy as architectural space. You can find from fencing school to clinics to offices to other types of classrooms, social amenities, all within subway stations, right? So the subway station doesn't work as, let's say, the London Tube that you just pay for your ticket and tap out and tap in and tap out, right? So in Seoul, it actually works as an extension of the city at an underground level. So in this condition of the Go City where everything can move above ground, maybe this is the only thing that's static, this underground megastructure. And things just plug in. They plug in wherever they need because there's already an underground framework for it. So I would say I wouldn't see these transportation networks as, let's say, the hubs, the stations themselves as movable. I would see them as the fixable megastructure, as the fixed space in the city.
Thank you for the answer. Does anyone want to say any comment before we close? Okay.
Thank you very much for sharing your research and comment. I really like actually to see your physicality. So, well, while you are having the presentation, I also thinking that it would be great to have your physical environment you proposed became the exhibition environments. Yeah, but due to the budget issue, we need to discuss more. But I really want so. There are ideal suggestion and question now, but I think this will be a routine suggestion and question one day. And so we have asked this question in the past and now, and I think we will ask this question in the future. So I think it's very like meaningful topic in this situation. So I really, really appreciate all the participation and then all the comment from panels. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm glad I joined, even though I was late.
Oh, thank you very much for joining today.
I'm glad you joined.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Good luck.